The gunshot crackled through the still morning air as Josephine Blackwood stared down at the smoking barrel in her trembling hands. Her father's lifeless body sprawled before her on the wooden porch of their remote homestead. The year was 1875, and in the unforgiving plains of the Dakota Territory, a woman who killed a man even in self-defense was as good as damned. "He would have killed me," she whispered to the rising sun, the bruises on her neck still fresh from where his fingers had dug into her flesh. For 3 years since her mother's passing, Josephine had endured his drunken rages, his blame, his fists. Now, at 22, she'd finally fought back. Word traveled fast across the prairie, carried on horseback from homestead to homestead, gathering embellishments with each telling. By the time the story reached Clearwater, the nearest town 15 miles east, Josephine Blackwood had become a cold-blooded murderer, a witch who'd summoned dark forces, a harbinger of death. The town marshal and 2 deputies arrived by midday. They found her sitting on the porch steps, her long auburn hair loose around her shoulders, her green eyes vacant. She didn't resist when they bound her wrists, didn't protest when they led her to their horses. "Knew there was something wrong with that girl the minute her mama died," the marshal muttered. "Always too quiet, too strange." "My father tried to kill me," Josephine said flatly. "I defended myself." The marshal snorted. "Save it for the judge, Miss Blackwood. Though I doubt he'll listen to a woman with the devil in her eyes." The jail in Clearwater was little more than a cramped wooden structure with 2 cells. Josephine sat on the thin mattress, her back against the wall, listening to the whispers outside. Cursed, that's what she is. Always knew there was something unnatural about her. Ain't right for a woman to kill her own kin. Heard crops failed wherever she walked. The judge arrived 3 days later, a portly man whose black coat strained against his belly. The trial, if it could be called such, lasted less than an hour. No one spoke in her defense. No one questioned why a father might deserve his daughter's wrath. The bruises on her neck had faded to a sickly yellow, easily dismissed as some other misfortune. "Josephine Blackwood," the judge declared, "while the evidence suggests you killed your father, I find insufficient cause to hang you." A murmur of dissatisfaction rippled through the gathered crowd. "However, I cannot in good conscience allow you to remain among decent folk. You are hereby banished from Clearwater and its surrounding territories. Should you return, you will be treated as an outlaw." That night, a mob gathered outside the jail. They didn't break and they didn't need to. The marshal himself unlocked her cell at midnight. "Time for you to go, Blackwood," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Town's decided they don't want to wait till morning." "Where am I supposed to go?" Josephine asked, rising from the thin mattress. The marshal tossed a small bundle at her feet. "Your things. There's a canteen of water. Head west and don't stop. Don't let anyone see your face around here again." He led her out the back door where a scrawny mare waited, saddled but barely fit for the journey ahead. "Marshal, please," Josephine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have nowhere. You're a curse on this land, girl," he cut her off. "My own crops withered the day you were brought in. Stillborn calf at the Reynolds place. Sickness in the miller's youngest. You bring death wherever you go." Torchlight flickered at the corner of the building. Voices grew louder. "Ride west," the marshal said, nearly shoving her onto the horse. "And pray someone out there's fool enough to take you in." With nothing but the clothes on her back, a small bundle of possessions, and a half-filled canteen, Josephine Blackwood rode into the night, the jeers and curses of the townspeople fading behind her as she urged the reluctant mare westward into the unknown darkness. The Dakota night was cold, even in late spring. Josephine rode until the horse could go no further, finding shelter in a shallow cave as dawn broke on her first day of exile. Sleep came in fits and starts, haunted by her father's face, his hands around her throat, the sudden kick of the pistol that ended his life. When she woke fully, The sun was high, and her meager water supply half gone. For 3 days, she followed what appeared to be a game trail, rationing water carefully, gathering what berries and roots she recognized from her mother's teachings. On the 4th day, the mare went lame, forcing Josephine to continue on foot, leading the struggling animal behind her. On the 6th day, the water ran out. By the 7th, she was stumbling, her lips cracked, her vision blurring at the edges. The mare had abandoned her during the night, seeking water on its own. Josephine couldn't blame the creature. Survival demanded selfishness. She crested a small hill as the sun began to set on the 8th day, her legs trembling beneath her, when she saw a thin spiral of smoke rising against the darkening sky. A campfire, perhaps a mile distant. Shelter. People. Water. Or death, if they'd heard about the cursed woman from Clearwater. Desperation won over caution. Josephine stumbled toward the smoke, her feet dragging through the tall prairie grass. Night had fully descended by the time she approached the small campsite, the glow of the fire guiding her final steps. A man sat before the flames, his back to her, a battered hat beside him on a blanket. A large black horse grazed nearby, secured by a long tether. Josephine hesitated at the edge of the firelight, suddenly aware of how she must appear filthy, half-starved, wild-eyed. Her foot dislodged a stone, sending it skittering. The man was on his feet instantly, revolver drawn, and aimed at her heart before she could blink. "Step into the light," he commanded, his voice low and steady. "Hands where I can see them." Josephine raised her trembling hands. "Please," she rasped, her throat too dry for more. The man, tall, broad-shouldered, with several days' growth of beard on his face, narrowed his eyes. He looked to be in his early 30s, his skin weathered by sun and wind, his dark hair falling to his shoulders. "You alone?" he asked, gun still trained on her. Josephine nodded, swaying slightly. "You look half dead," he observed, lowering his weapon slightly. "What's a woman doing out here alone?" She opened her mouth to answer, but darkness encroached on her vision. The last thing she saw was the alarmed expression on the stranger's face as the ground rushed up to meet her. Josephine woke to the sensation of cool water against her lips. She drank greedily, nearly choking in her desperation. "Easy," the man's voice cautioned. "Small sips or you'll make yourself sick." She was lying on a blanket near the fire, another blanket draped over her. The night sky wheeled above, stars scattered like salt across black velvet. She turned her head to find the stranger watching her, his expression guarded. "Thank you," she managed after another careful sip. "You want to tell me what you're doing out here alone?" he asked. "These parts aren't safe for anyone traveling solo, let alone a woman." Josephine closed her eyes. "I had no choice. There's always a choice." "Not for me." She looked at him again. "What's your name?" He hesitated, as if weighing whether she deserved to know. "Hayes," he finally said. "Henry Hayes." "Josephine Blackwood." He nodded once, then reached for something beside him. "Can you eat?" "Got some beans and salt pork." The smell of food made her stomach clench painfully. She nodded, trying to sit up. Henry moved to help her, his hands strong but careful as he propped her against a saddle. "Where you headed?" he asked as he spooned beans onto a tin plate. "Nowhere specific," Josephine answered. "Just west." "Running from something?" She stared into the fire. "Everyone." Henry didn't press further, simply handed her the plate and a spoon. Josephine ate slowly, savoring each bite, aware of his eyes on her. "I'm heading to Valor Creek," he said after a while. "Mining town about 4 days' ride from here. Was going to prospect a bit before moving on." Josephine nodded but said nothing. "Once you're stronger, I can take you there," he continued. "Might find work. Place to stay." "Why would you help me?" she asked, her voice quiet. Henry shrugged. "Can't leave a woman to die on the prairie. Wouldn't be right." You don't know me. Know enough. You're in trouble and you're alone. He took the empty plate from her hands. Get some rest. We'll talk more in the morning. Josephine wanted to argue, to tell him he should leave her behind, that people called her cursed, that misfortune followed in her wake. But exhaustion pulled her under, and she slept deeply for the first time in days. Morning brought clarity and with it, fear. Josephine woke to find Henry already up, tending to his horse. She sat up slowly, testing her strength. Her body ached, but the desperate thirst and dizziness had passed. Morning, Henry called, glancing over his shoulder. There's coffee in the pot. Josephine poured herself a cup, cradling the tin between her hands. I should go, she said when he returned to the fire. Henry frowned. Go where? It doesn't matter. I can't go with you. Why not? She stared into her coffee. People say I'm cursed. To her surprise, Henry laughed a short, gruff sound. People say a lot of things. They're right, she insisted. Bad things happen around me. Bad things happen everywhere, he countered, pouring himself coffee. Nature of life out here. You don't understand. I understand you're a woman alone with no horse, no water, and nowhere to go, Henry interrupted. Whatever you're running from, whatever curse you think you carry, it can't be worse than certain death on the prairie. Josephine really looked at him for the first time. His eyes were a deep brown, almost black in certain light, set in a face that had seen its share of hardship. A thin scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into his beard. His hands, wrapped around his coffee cup, were calloused and strong. Why Valor Creek? She asked, changing the subject. Heard there's good money to be made. Gold in the hills, they say. You're a prospector? Henry's mouth curved in what might have been a smile. Sometimes.
Coant, bounty hunter, what ver pays?
Been drifting since the war. Which side? Union, he said. Though out here, that hardly matters anymore. Josephine nodded, then set down her cup. If I go with you to Valor Creek, you have to promise me something. What's that? If misfortune finds you because of me, you'll let me leave. No questions asked. Henry studied her for a long moment, then nodded once.
Deal.
Though I think you'll find I've had my share of bad luck long before meeting you, Miss Blackwood. They broke camp within the hour. Henry insisted Josephine ride his horse, a massive black gelding named Midnight, while he walked alongside. She protested, but he was unmoved. You're still weak, he pointed out. And we'll make better time this way than if you collapse again. By midday, they had covered several miles, the landscape gradually changing from flat prairie to rolling hills dotted with scrub and the occasional copse of trees. Henry was mostly silent, speaking only to point out landmarks or to ask if she needed to rest. During one such break, Josephine gathered her courage. Aren't you going to ask? Henry looked up from adjusting Midnight's saddle. Ask what? Why people call me cursed. Why, I was alone. He shrugged. Figure you'll tell me if you want to. Most people would be curious. I'm not most people. He finished with the saddle and straightened. Though I admit I've wondered. Josephine took a deep breath. I killed my father. She expected shock, disgust, fear, anything but the calm assessment Henry gave her. He give you reason? He asked quietly. Josephine's hand instinctively went to her throat, where the bruises had faded, but the memory remained vivid. Yes. Henry nodded once. Then he had it coming. The simple acceptance in those words nearly broke her. Josephine turned away, blinking rapidly to clear the sudden moisture from her eyes. People in town didn't see it that way, she continued after a moment. They called me a witch, said I brought misfortune. The judge banished me rather than hang me. Said I was a curse on the land. Superstitious fools, Henry muttered. A woman defends herself, and they call it witchcraft. Seen it before. You have? War changes how you see things, he said, offering her a hand up to the saddle. Makes you understand that men and women do what they must to survive. Doesn't make them cursed. As Josephine settled back into the saddle, she felt something shift inside her, a small loosening of the knot of shame and fear she'd carried since that fateful morning on her father's porch. They made camp that evening near a small stream, the water a blessing after their long day's journey. Henry taught her how to set snares, and they caught 2 rabbits for their dinner. As they sat by the fire, bellies full for the first time in days, Josephine found herself studying her unexpected companion. "Why are you really helping me?" she asked. Henry poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks dancing into the night sky. "Maybe I've seen too many good people crushed by bad circumstances. Is that what I am? A good person?" His eyes met hers across the flames. "I think you're a survivor. And out here, that's what matters most." The following days fell into a rhythm. They would rise with the sun, break camp, and travel until midday. Henry began allowing Josephine to walk beside him for short stretches, rebuilding her strength. In the evenings, he taught her how to read the land, how to identify edible plants, how to move silently through the underbrush when hunting. On the 3rd night, as they sat beside their campfire, a coyote's howl pierced the darkness, followed by another, then another. "They're close," Josephine observed, wrapping her blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Hunting," Henry agreed. "But they won't bother us." "How can you be sure?" "Coyotes are smart. They know better than to tangle with humans unless they're desperate." He added another stick to the fire. "Besides, they're probably more afraid of you than you are of them." "Because I'm cursed?" she asked, a hint of bitterness in her voice. Henry's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Because you're stronger than you look." Josephine snorted softly. "I don't feel strong. You survived your father. You survived exile. You're still here." He looked at her across the flames. "That's strength." They fell silent, listening to the night sounds around them, the crackle of the fire, the rustle of wind through grass, the distant coyotes. "My mother taught me about herbs," Josephine said suddenly. "How to heal with plants, how to ease pain. After she died, people started saying she'd taught me witchcraft, that I could curse their cattle or blight their crops." "Could you?" Henry asked, his tone light. Josephine smiled despite herself. "If I could, don't you think I'd have cursed my father years ago?" "Fair point." It was easier for them to believe I was something unnatural than to accept that a woman might defend herself against a man. She stared into the flames. "Easier to call me cursed than to admit they'd turned a blind eye to his cruelty for years." Henry was quiet for a long moment. "People fear what they don't understand," he finally said. "And they don't understand a woman with the courage to fight back." The next morning, they crested a hill to find a sprawling valley below them, a ribbon of river cutting through its center. On the far side, nestled against the foothills, lay a cluster of buildings, Valor Creek. "Bigger than I expected," Henry remarked, shading his eyes against the sun. Josephine felt a flutter of anxiety. "Will there be a telegraph office?" "Probably." "Why?" "If word of me is spread, if they've heard about the cursed woman from Clearwater." Henry turned to face her. "You're not the same woman who left Clearwater. Your hair's different. You're wearing my spare clothes. Besides, Valor Creek is far enough away that news travels slow, if at all." It was true. During their journey, Henry had suggested she cut her distinctive auburn hair. Now it barely reached her shoulders, giving her a different appearance altogether. And the oversized shirt and trousers he'd lent her made her look more like a young man than the woman who'd fled her hometown. "What if someone recognizes me?" "Then I'll deal with it," Henry said simply. They approached Valor Creek cautiously, skirting around to enter from the west rather than the east. The town was indeed larger than it appeared from a distance, a proper main street lined with false-fronted buildings, side streets branching off with smaller structures, and the constant din of the mining operations visible on the hillsides beyond. Henry led them to a modest livery stable where he arranged boarding for midnight. The stable hand, a gangly youth with a shock of blonde hair, eyed Josephine curiously but asked no questions. "We'll need a place to stay," Henry told her as they walked toward the main street. "And to find work, if we're going to remain here."
"Oui,"
Josephine asked, surprised. "I thought you were just bringing me here before moving on." Henry glanced at her. "Unless you'd prefer I leave." "No," she said quickly. "I just didn't expect." "Plans change," he said with a shrug. "Besides, I still need to see about those gold claims." The Valor Creek Hotel was a 3-story wooden structure with peeling paint and a wide porch. Inside, a harried-looking clerk barely glanced at them as Henry requested 2 rooms. "Only got one available," the clerk said, pushing a ledger toward him. "Second floor, end of the hall." Henry hesitated, looking at Josephine. "I can find somewhere else," she said quietly. "No need," the clerk interjected, misunderstanding their exchange. "Plenty of boarding houses in town for your companion." He gave Josephine a dismissive look. Henry's expression hardened. "My wife will be staying with me," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Josephine's eyes widened, but she remained silent as Henry signed the ledger and paid for the room. Only when they were climbing the stairs did she whisper, "Wife." "Simplest explanation," he murmured back. "Unless you preferred sister?" The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single chair by the window that overlooked the busy street below. Josephine stood awkwardly in the center of the room, acutely aware of Henry's presence. "I'll sleep on the floor," he said, reading her discomfort. "We should get you some proper clothes first, then see about work." "I have no money," Josephine reminded him. "I have enough to get started." She frowned. "I won't be indebted." "It's not debt," Henry interrupted. "It's investment. Get you set up so you can work, then you can pay your own way." Before she could argue further, he opened the door. "Come on. Let's see what Valor Creek has to offer a couple of newcomers." The general store provided Josephine with 2 simple dresses, undergarments, and a pair of sturdy boots that nearly fit. Henry purchased a few items for himself as well: ammunition, tobacco, a new shirt to replace the one he'd given her. As they left the store, a commotion further down the street caught their attention. A crowd had gathered outside the assay office, voices raised in anger. "What's happening?" Josephine asked a woman who hurried past them. "Another claim jumped," the woman replied without slowing. "Third one this month. That foreman from the mining companies behind it, mark my words." Henry and Josephine exchanged glances, then moved closer to observe. A middle-aged man with a gray-streaked beard was shouting at a younger, well-dressed individual who stood flanked by 2 burly men. "You can't do this, Sullivan," the older man yelled. "That claim is rightfully mine." "The paperwork says otherwise, Miller," the well-dressed man Sullivan replied smoothly. "Perhaps you should have registered it properly." "I did register it." "You bribed the assayer to change the records." Sullivan's expression hardened. "That's a serious accusation. I'd advise you to retract it before my associates take offense." The 2 large men beside Sullivan shifted menacingly. The crowd murmured, but no one stepped forward to support Miller. "This isn't right," Josephine whispered. "Someone should help him." Henry's hand settled on her arm. "Not our fight," he said quietly. "Not yet. We need to understand the lay of the land first." Reluctantly, Josephine allowed him to guide her away from the confrontation. They continued down the street, passing saloons, a barber shop, and finally reaching a small restaurant that advertised home cooking in its window. Over a simple meal of beef stew and cornbread, Henry laid out their options. "Mining's the main business here, but it sounds complicated. I could try for work as a guard or labor."
"For you."
"I can cook," Josephine offered. "And so, my mother taught me healing too, though I don't know if they'd trust a woman doctor here." "Probably not," Henry agreed. but there might be a need for a seamstress or cook. We'll ask around. As they finished their meal, the restaurant owner, a plump woman named Mrs. Whitaker, approached their table. "Couldn't help overhearing you're looking for work," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "My girl just left to get married in Carson City. Could use help in the kitchen if you're interested." She looked at Josephine expectantly. Yes, I'd be very interested," Josephine replied, surprised at the sudden opportunity. "Pays $3 a week plus meals," Mrs. Whitaker continued. "Start tomorrow morning, 6 sharp?" "She'll be here," Henry confirmed before Josephine could respond. As Mrs. Whitaker walked away, Josephine turned to Henry. "That was fortunate. See? No curse follows you." He smiled slightly. "Just good timing." They spent the remainder of the day exploring Valor Creek, learning its layout, observing its residents. Henry made inquiries at the mining company office, but was told they weren't hiring guards. At the livery stable, however, the owner mentioned needing help breaking horses, a job Henry readily accepted. "It's settled then," he said as they returned to their hotel room that evening. "We both have work. We can stay here until we save enough to move on, if that's what you want." Josephine sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing her new dress over her knees. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked, the question that had been burning in her mind for days. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Henry leaned against the windowsill, arms crossed over his chest. "Maybe I was tired of being alone," he said after a long pause. "Or maybe I understand what it's like to be judged for things beyond your control." "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then unbuttoned his shirt cuff and rolled up his left sleeve. A jagged scar ran from his wrist to his elbow, puckered and white against his sun-darkened skin. "Confederate prison camp," he said quietly. "Some folks back east saw this and decided I must have done something to deserve it. That I was somehow less because of it." He rolled his sleeve back down. "People fear what makes them uncomfortable. They call it a curse because that's easier than seeing the truth." Josephine stared at him, seeing not pity in his eyes but understanding, perhaps the first true understanding she'd encountered since her mother's death. "Thank you," she whispered. Henry nodded once, then grabbed a spare blanket from the bed. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow's an early start for both of us." True to his word, Henry made a pallet on the floor, giving Josephine the bed. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her for hours as she listened to his steady breathing, wondering at the strange twist of fate that had brought this solitary cowboy into her life just when she needed him most. The following weeks established a routine for them both. Josephine rose before dawn to report to Mrs. Whitaker's kitchen, where she quickly proved herself capable and hardworking. Henry spent his days at the livery, breaking wild horses and occasionally escorting shipments of or to the larger town of Silver Ridge, 30 miles to the south. In the evenings, they would share a meal, often leftovers Josephine brought from the restaurant, and exchange stories of their day. Henry spoke little of his past, but occasionally shared tales of his travels since the war. Josephine found herself telling him about her mother, about the herbs and remedies she'd learned, about the simpler times before her father's drinking had consumed him. A tentative friendship formed between them, built on mutual respect and the shared experience of outsiders finding their place. If the hotel clerk or other townspeople assumed they were truly married, neither Henry nor Josephine corrected them. The pretense provided a certain protection, particularly for Josephine. One evening, about 3 weeks after their arrival in Valor Creek, Henry returned to their room with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" Josephine asked as he handed it to her. "Open it and see." Inside was a small leather-bound journal and a pencil. Josephine looked up at him questioningly. "You mentioned your mother taught you about herbs," Henry explained, suddenly looking uncomfortable. "Thought you might want to write it down. Preserve the knowledge." The thoughtfulness of the gesture caught Josephine off guard. She ran her fingers over the smooth leather cover, throat tight with emotion. Thank you, she said softly. I've been wanting to record her remedies. I was afraid I'd forget them. Henry nodded, seeming relieved at her response. Knowledge like that shouldn't be lost. That night, Josephine began filling the pages with detailed descriptions of plants, their uses, the careful preparation required for each remedy. As she wrote, she felt her mother's presence more strongly than she had in years, as if the act of preserving her teachings somehow kept her spirit alive. The town of Valor Creek, meanwhile, simmered with tension. The dispute between independent miners and the mining company owned by a man named James Sullivan grew increasingly heated. Claims were contested, equipment mysteriously damaged, accusations of bribery and corruption flew freely. Henry kept his distance from the conflict, but Josephine heard plenty while working in the restaurant. Mrs. Whitaker's establishment was a gathering place for miners and townspeople alike, and conversation flowed as freely as the coffee. Sullivan's men broke Thompson's arm yesterday, one miner reported grimly over breakfast. Said he was trespassing on company land. That was Thompson's claim before Sullivan ever came to town, another argued. Don't matter now. Sullivan's got the law in his pocket. The sheriff, a thin, nervous man named Perkins, seemed unwilling or unable to intervene in the escalating situation. Rumors suggested he received regular payments from Sullivan to look the other way. One afternoon, as Josephine was preparing vegetables for the evening meal, Mrs. Whitaker approached her with an unusual request. "Miller's boy is sick," she said, referring to the miner they'd seen arguing with Sullivan their first day in town. "Fever won't break. Doc's away in Silver Ridge till next week." "I'm sorry to hear that," Josephine replied cautiously. Mrs. Whitaker lowered her voice. "Heard you telling Martha about your mother's remedies yesterday. Something for fever." Josephine hesitated. Her knowledge of herbal medicine had been part of what led to the accusations of witchcraft in Clearwater. And yet, a child was suffering. "I know a tea that might help," she admitted. "Willow bark mainly, with a few other herbs. Could you make some? I'd consider it a personal favor." After a moment's consideration, Josephine nodded. "I'll need to gather the ingredients." That evening, she explained the situation to Henry as they ate dinner in their room. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "If something goes wrong." "A child is sick," Josephine said firmly. "I can't refuse to help because I'm afraid of rumors." Henry studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll go with you to collect what you need. And to the miller's place." The next morning, before dawn, they ventured to the creek outside town where Josephine had noticed willow trees growing. She carefully harvested bark, explaining to Henry how to select the right pieces, how to strip it without damaging the tree. They gathered other herbs from the hillside's feverfew, elderflower, mint before returning to town. In their hotel room, Josephine prepared the remedy, crushing herbs with the back of a spoon, boiling water over the small stove in the corner, steeping the mixture carefully, while Henry watched with evident fascination. "My mother could do this in her sleep," Josephine said as she strained the tea into a bottle. "She always seemed to know exactly how much of each plant to use, how long to steep it." "I'm still learning." "You seem confident enough to me," Henry observed. Josephine smiled slightly. "Some remedies I know better than others. This one she used often. My father's drinking gave him terrible headaches." The Miller cabin sat on the outskirts of town, a modest structure with a well-tended garden out front. Mrs. Miller, a careworn woman with prematurely gray hair, answered their knock, eyeing them suspiciously until Mrs. Whitaker's name was mentioned. "Martha said you might have something to help Tommy," she said, opening the door wider. "He's been burning up for 3 days now." The boy lay on a small bed in the corner of the main room, his face flushed with fever, breathing labored. Josephine estimated he was about 10 years old, though fever had made his features pinched and older-looking. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward him. Mrs. Miller nodded, hovering anxiously as Josephine examined the child. She felt his pulse, checked his eyes, noted the rash spreading across his chest. "Scarlet fever, I think," she said quietly. "The tea will help with the fever and pain, but he needs to drink plenty of water too." She instructed Mrs. Miller on how to administer the remedy, a spoonful every few hours, diluted slightly for a child, and left the bottle with strict instructions to keep the boy cool and watch for any changes. As they left the cabin, Henry walked close beside her, his presence reassuring. "You did a good thing," he said. "No matter what happens." "I pray it helps him," Josephine replied. "Children are more vulnerable to fever." That evening, worry kept her awake long after Henry had fallen asleep on his pallet. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the occasional sounds from the street below, a drunk's laughter, a dog's bark, the wind rattling the loose shutter on the building across the way. What if the boy died despite her remedy? What if people blamed her? Would she be forced to flee again, branded a witch in yet another town? A soft knock at their door startled her from her thoughts. Henry was instantly awake, gun in hand, as he moved silently to the door. "Who's there?" he called quietly. "Mrs. Miller," came the reply. "I need to speak with Miss Josephine." Henry glanced at Josephine, who had wrapped a shawl around her nightdress, and nodded. He opened the door cautiously. Mrs. Miller stood in the hallway, her face streaked with tears. Josephine's heart sank. "The fever broke an hour ago," Mrs. Miller said, her voice trembling. "Tommy's sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. The doctor in town couldn't do anything but your tea." She reached for Josephine's hands. "Thank you. My husband says to tell you anything we have is yours." Relief washed over Josephine like a physical wave. "I'm just glad he's improving," she managed. "Keep giving him the tea until it's gone. And make sure he drinks plenty of water." After Mrs. Miller left, Josephine turned to find Henry watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "You saved that boy's life," he said simply. "We don't know that. The fever might have broken on its own." Henry shook his head. "Take the win, Josephine. You did good." Word of Tommy Miller's recovery spread quickly through Valor Creek. By the following afternoon, 3 more people had approached Josephine at the restaurant, asking about remedies for various ailments: a miner with chronic pain from an old injury, a woman suffering from persistent headaches, a shopkeeper's wife with a colicky baby. Mrs. Whitaker watched these interactions with obvious approval. "Told you your knowledge would be valuable here," she said as they prepared the evening meal. "People respect useful skills." "In Clearwater, they called it witchcraft," Josephine reminded her. The older woman snorted. "Clearwater's full of fools then. Out here, we care about results, not rumors." Over the next few days, Josephine found herself creating remedies in the evenings, Henry helping her gather ingredients during their free time. She was careful to explain each remedy thoroughly, to manage expectations, to present her knowledge as practical rather than mystical. And people responded with gratitude rather than suspicion. For the first time since her mother's death, Josephine felt her skills appreciated rather than feared. Henry watched this transformation with quiet satisfaction. "Told you no curse follows you," he said one evening as they walked back to the hotel after collecting mint by the creek. "Just the opposite. You're bringing healing where it's needed." Josephine glanced at him, struck by how different he seemed from the guarded man who had found her collapsing on the prairie. His face was more open now, his rare smiles coming more frequently, especially when they were alone. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," she said softly. Henry looked away, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "You'd have found your way." "No," she insisted. "I was dying when you found me. And even after that, I needed someone to believe in me before I could believe in myself." She touched his arm lightly. "Thank you for that." He covered her hand with his own briefly, the gesture speaking volumes that his words could not. Their comfortable routine was shattered 3 days later when Frank Miller, Tommy's father, burst into the restaurant during the busy lunch hour, his face bloodied, his clothing torn. "Sullivan's men," he gasped, clutching the doorframe for support. "They're burning us out. All the independent claims." The restaurant erupted in chaos as miners abandoned their meals, rushing for the door. Henry, who had stopped by to see Josephine on his way to the livery, immediately moved to Miller's side. "How many men?" he demanded. "Dozen or more," Miller replied, wiping blood from his eye.
Armed.
"They've already set fire to Simmons' place and mine. Said they're clearing out claim jumpers." "You've had that claim for years," Mrs. Whitaker protested.
"Sullivan don't care about that.
"He wants it all." Henry turned to Josephine. "Stay here," he said firmly. "I'm going to see what's happening." "No," she replied, already untying her apron. "Those people might need help. Medical help." "It's too dangerous. I'm coming," she insisted. "I can't hide while people are hurt." Their eyes locked in a silent battle of wills. Finally, Henry nodded curtly. "Stay behind me. If I say run, you run.
No arguments."
They followed the crowd toward the mining claims outside town. Black smoke billowed from the direction of the creek, where the independent miners had staked their claims. As they crested the hill, the scene below made Josephine gasp. 3 cabins were already engulfed in flames. Men on horseback, Sullivan's hired guns, circled the area, firing warning shots to keep the miners from saving their homes and equipment. In the center of it all stood Sullivan himself, mounted on a gleaming bay horse, watching the destruction with apparent satisfaction. "This is madness," Henry muttered. "Where's the sheriff?" "Conveniently absent, I'd wager," replied a miner nearby. The crowd of townspeople and miners had grown to nearly 50 strong, but Sullivan's armed men kept them at bay with raised rifles. The tension in the air was palpable, violence imminent. Henry turned to Josephine. "I don't like this. You should go back to town." Before she could respond, a shot rang out. One of the miners had drawn his pistol, firing at Sullivan's men. The response was immediate, a volley of gunfire that sent townspeople diving for cover. In the chaos, Josephine lost sight of Henry. She pressed herself against a boulder, heart pounding as bullets whizzed overhead. When the initial exchange ended, cries for help rose from the wounded. Despite the danger, Josephine's healer instincts took over. She spotted a man clutching his bleeding arm about 20 yards away and darted toward him, keeping low. "Let me see," she ordered, tearing a strip from her petticoat to use as a bandage. "Just grazed me," the man grunted, though he didn't resist as she examined the wound. "Keep pressure on it," she instructed, tying the makeshift bandage. "I'll come back with something to clean it." More shots echoed across the valley as she moved to the next injured person, a younger man with a bullet wound in his thigh. This one was more serious, blood pulsing from the wound with each heartbeat. Josephine tore more strips from her petticoat, creating a tourniquet above the wound. "Hold this tight," she told the miner kneeling beside the wounded man. "Don't release it until help comes." For the next hour, she moved from victim to victim, treating wounds as best she could with limited supplies. 6 men had been shot, though none fatally as far as she could determine. Sullivan's men had withdrawn to the mining company's compound further up the valley, taking their own wounded with them. The sheriff finally appeared as the fires burned down to smoldering ruins, too late to do anything but observe the aftermath. His half-hearted offers to investigate were met with derision from the miners. It wasn't until the wounded had been transported to town, the fires fully extinguished, that Josephine realized Henry was nowhere to be found. Fear clutched at her heart as she searched the dispersing crowd. "Have you seen Henry Hayes?" she asked person after person, growing more frantic with each negative response. Finally, a miner pointed toward the creek. "Saw a tall fella head that way with Miller about an hour ago. Think he was helping evacuate some of the families." Josephine hurried in that direction, picking her way through the charred remains of cabins and equipment. She found Henry at last, helping an elderly miner salvage tools from a partially burned shed. "Henry," she called, relief making her voice unsteady. He looked up, his face smudged with soot, eyes immediately seeking any sign of injury. "Are you hurt?"
No.
"I was worried about you." "I'm fine," he assured her, though she noticed he was favoring his left arm.
What about you?
"I saw you treating the wounded. 6 shot, none critical. Others with burns and minor injuries." She stepped closer, examining his arm. "You're hurt." "It's nothing. Timber fell when we were checking for people in Miller's cabin." Josephine insisted on examining it anyway, finding a nasty burn along his forearm. "This needs treatment," she said firmly. "We're going back to town." The mining conflict dominated all conversation in Valor Creek over the next several days. Sullivan had overplayed his hand, burning out established miners and shooting townspeople had turned public opinion decisively against him. A telegram was sent to the territorial governor requesting intervention. Meanwhile, Josephine found herself busier than ever. In addition to her work at the restaurant, she was now treating various injuries from the confrontation. Henry's burn healed cleanly thanks to her salve of comfrey and honey, though he complained good-naturedly about the smell. One evening, about a week after the incident, they sat in their hotel room discussing the future. The territorial marshal was due to arrive the following day to investigate the violence. "Sullivan won't go down easily," Henry observed. "Men like him rarely do." "The whole town witnessed what happened," Josephine pointed out. "Even the sheriff can't ignore that." "Maybe." Henry didn't sound convinced. "Either way, things are bound to change around here." "Are you thinking of moving on?" Josephine asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. Henry looked at her thoughtfully.
Depends.
"On what?" "On whether you want to stay." The simple statement hung in the air between them, weighted with unspoken meaning. Josephine realized with sudden clarity that somewhere along their journey, her future and Henry's had become intertwined in her mind. The thought of continuing without him felt wrong somehow, incomplete. "I've been thinking," she said carefully. "People here need medical care. The doctor in town is elderly, often absent. My remedies are helping." "You're thinking of staying? Setting up as a healer?" Josephine nodded. "If the marshal restores order, if Sullivan's power is broken, this could be a good place to put down roots." Henry was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You're not worried about your curse anymore?" "No one here sees me that way," she replied. "They see what I can do, not what they fear." "Because you showed them the truth," Henry said quietly. "You had the courage to be yourself despite what happened in Clearwater." "I had help," Josephine reminded him, meeting his eyes. "Someone who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." The air between them seemed charged suddenly, like the stillness before a storm. Henry rose from his chair and moved to the window, staring out at the darkened street below. "I haven't stayed in one place since before the war," he said, his back to her. "Never found anywhere that felt right." "And now?" Josephine asked, her heart beating faster. Henry turned to face her. "Now I'm thinking maybe it's not about the place. Maybe it's about the people." The territorial marshal arrived the following day with 6 deputies, immediately establishing authority by summoning Sullivan and the sheriff to a public hearing in the town hall. Josephine and Henry attended along with most of Valor Creek's residents, standing at the back of the crowded room. Sullivan arrived flanked by his men, his demeanor still arrogant despite the circumstances. The sheriff slunk in separately, clearly uncomfortable under the marshal's stern gaze. For 3 hours, the marshal heard testimony from miners who'd been burned out, from townspeople who'd witnessed the violence, from Sullivan himself, who claimed he was merely protecting company property from claim jumpers. These claims were legally registered, Miller testified, producing documentation. Sullivan bribed the assayer to alter the records. The assayer, a nervous man named Hoffman, initially denied the accusation but broke down under the marshal's questioning, admitting Sullivan had paid him to change claim boundaries on official maps. By day's end, Sullivan had been arrested on multiple charges, and the sheriff suspended pending investigation into his negligence. The marshal announced he would remain in Valor Creek until order was fully restored and legal ownership of all claims verified. As they left the town hall, Henry and Josephine found themselves walking alongside the Millers. "Justice at last," Miller said with satisfaction. "Though it won't rebuild our homes. The community will help," Josephine assured him. "Everyone I've spoken to is eager to assist, including us," Henry added. "I've got experience with construction." Mrs. Miller smiled warmly at Josephine. "We won't forget what you did for Tommy. Or for the injured men. This town needs someone with your skills." Later that evening, as they walked back to the hotel after dinner, Henry seemed unusually thoughtful. "I saw a property for sale today," he said suddenly. "Small house on the edge of town. Has a good-sized garden plot." Josephine looked at him in surprise. "You're thinking of buying it?" "Thinking about it. Would need some work, but it's solid. Big enough for a healing practice. Maybe a small stable eventually." "Henry." Josephine stopped walking, turning to face him. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" He met her eyes, and for the first time since she'd known him, he seemed uncertain. "I'm saying I'd like to stay. Here. With you. If that's what you want to." "As friends? Partners?" she asked, her heart hammering in her chest. Henry took a deep breath. "As whatever you'll have me as," he said quietly. "I care for you, Josephine. More than I expected to. More than I've cared for anyone in a long time." The admission, so simple, so honest, pierced through the last of Josephine's defenses. The man before her had saved her life, had believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself, had shown her that her past didn't have to define her future. "They called me cursed," she whispered. "Said misfortune followed me. That anyone who took me in would suffer." Henry's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Then I'll take the curse too," he said simply. "Gladly." He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I've lived with ghosts long enough. Prison. Wandering. Then I found you, and for the first time in years, I started thinking about tomorrow instead of yesterday." Josephine's eyes filled with tears. "I never thought I'd find someone who could see past what others called me. Who could see me." "I see you," Henry said softly. "I've seen you from the beginning. Under the stars of the Dakota Territory, with the sounds of Valor Creek's saloons and the distant rush of the creek as backdrop." Josephine rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips to Henry's. His arms came around her waist, drawing her closer as he returned the kiss with a tenderness that made her heart ache. When they finally parted, Henry's smile was brighter than she'd ever seen it. "Is that a yes to the house?" he asked, his voice husky. Josephine laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Yes to the house. Yes to staying. Yes to everything." The rebuilding of Valor Creek's mining community began in earnest the following week. With Sullivan awaiting trial in the territorial capital and a new sheriff appointed by the marshal, a sense of optimism spread through the town. Henry and Josephine purchased the small house he'd mentioned, paying with their combined savings and a loan from the bank secured against Henry's newly registered mining claim, a modest plot near Miller's that showed promising signs of copper rather than gold. The house required significant work, but townspeople pitched in willingly, grateful for Josephine's continued medical assistance and Henry's help with the miners' reconstructed cabins. By midsummer, the two-bedroom structure was habitable, with a large garden plot already sprouting herbs and vegetables. Josephine converted the second bedroom into a treatment room, complete with shelves for her expanding collection of remedies and a comfortable examination table Henry built himself. Word of her healing skills spread beyond Valor Creek to surrounding homesteads and smaller settlements, bringing a steady stream of patients. For his part, Henry divided his time between their copper claim, which produced modest but consistent returns, and horse trading, a business that utilized his skills with difficult animals and allowed him to travel occasionally to larger towns for supplies Josephine needed. Their marriage took place that autumn, a simple ceremony in the town's small church with the Millers as witnesses. Josephine wore a dress of deep blue calico, with wildflowers in her hair that had grown back to its original length. Henry, uncomfortable in his Sunday best, nevertheless stood tall and proud as he promised to stand by her through whatever life brought them. "Never thought I'd see the day," Mrs. Whitaker remarked at the small reception afterward. "When you two first arrived, he looked like a man who'd never stay put, and you like a woman with too many secrets." "People change," Josephine replied, watching Henry across the room as he awkwardly accepted congratulations from minors he'd come to call friends. "No," Mrs. Whitaker corrected with a knowing smile. "People reveal themselves when they find where they belong." That night, in their home, Josephine and Henry sat on the porch swing he'd built the previous month, watching stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. "Happy?" Henry asked, his arm warm around her shoulders. "More than I ever thought possible," she answered truthfully. "A year ago, I was certain my life was over, that I'd never find peace, never mind happiness." Henry pressed a kiss to her temple. "Just goes to show, you can't predict the future." "Speaking of the future," Josephine said, taking his hand and placing it gently on her abdomen, "there's something I should tell you." His eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Are you certain?" Josephine nodded, watching emotions play across his face: shock, wonder, and finally a joy so pure it brought tears to her eyes. "When?" he asked, his voice hushed with awe. "Spring, I think. April or May." Henry pulled her closer, his hand still resting protectively over the new life growing within her. "From curse to blessing," he murmured. "Who would have thought?" "You did," Josephine reminded him. "You saw beyond what others called me, beyond what I believed about myself." "Because I recognized something in you," Henry said. "The same hunger for belonging that I'd carried since the war. The same hope that somewhere, someday, the past could be just that, the past." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of their small-town distant piano music from the saloon, the occasional whinny of horses in nearby stables, the rustle of wind through the cottonwood trees that lined the creek. "What if the child inherits my curse?" Josephine asked suddenly, voicing the fear that had lingered despite everything. Henry turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Then we'll teach them what you've taught this town, that knowledge isn't witchcraft, that healing isn't cursed, that one person's fear doesn't define another's worth." His simple confidence, his unwavering belief in her, in them washed away the last shadows of doubt. Whatever came, they would face it together. The winter passed in peaceful preparation. Henry added a nursery to their home, carefully crafting a cradle from local pine. Josephine sewed tiny garments in the evenings, often joined by Mrs. Miller or other women from town who brought gifts and advice in equal measure. The mining community flourished under fairer leadership after Sullivan's conviction and imprisonment. Henry's copper claim proved modestly profitable, supplementing their income from Josephine's healing practice and his horse trading. Spring arrived with characteristic Dakota fickleness, warm days followed by sudden snowstorms, brilliant sunshine giving way to drenching rains. The garden behind their house burst into life, herbs and vegetables sprouting in neat rows Josephine had planted before her advancing pregnancy made such work difficult. Their daughter arrived on a clear May morning in 1876, after a difficult but ultimately uncomplicated birth attended by the town's elderly doctor and Mrs. Whitaker. Henry, who had paced anxiously outside their bedroom door for hours, fell instantly in love with the tiny, red-faced infant placed in his arms. "She has your eyes," he whispered to an exhausted but radiant Josephine. "And your strength." They named her Hope, a simple name for the profound change she represented in both their lives. In her small face, they saw not the shadows of the past, but the promise of the future they were building together. Word spread quickly through Valor Creek of the Hayes family's new addition. Visitors arrived daily, bringing gifts and good wishes. Even the territorial marshal, passing through on official business, stopped to offer congratulations and admire the baby. "Quite a change from when you first arrived," he observed to Henry as they stood on the porch, while Josephine rested inside. "Heard you were just passing through originally." Henry smiled, watching a hawk circle lazily in the clear blue sky above their home. "Sometimes the best journeys are the ones that end unexpectedly," he replied. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn evening, Josephine sat in the rocking chair by the fireplace, nursing Hope before bedtime. Henry entered from the treatment room where he'd been building additional shelves for her expanding collection of remedies and medicines. "Miller stopped by earlier," he said, settling into his chair across from her. "Wanted to thank you again for helping with his wife's rheumatism." Josephine smiled, gently stroking Hope's downy hair. "The willow bark tea is helping then?" "Says it's the only thing that has." Henry watched them for a moment, his expression thoughtful. He also mentioned something else. Said 3 families from Silver Ridge are moving here next month because they heard there's a healer in Valor Creek who doesn't charge the earth for her services. "Really?" Josephine looked up in surprise. "That's quite a journey, just for medical care."
Not just that.
Word spreading about this place. About how the miners stood together against Sullivan. About how the community rebuilds together. About a woman who was once called cursed, now being called blessed. Josephine felt a familiar tightness in her throat. "I never thought. When I left Clearwater." "I know." Henry rose and came to kneel beside her chair, one hand gently cradling Hope's tiny foot, the other covering Josephine's. "But that's the thing about curses and blessings. Sometimes they're the same thing, just seen through different eyes." Hope finished nursing and gazed up at them with wide, curious eyes that held no judgment, no fear, only the innocent wonder of new life. "I thank God every day that I found you on that prairie," Henry said softly. "That I was stubborn enough to ignore your warnings about curses and misfortune. And I thank God you were foolish enough to say you'd take the curse too," Josephine replied with a small smile. "It was the first time anyone had chosen me, knowing everything." Henry leaned forward to kiss her gently. "Best foolish decision I ever made." Outside their window, Valor Creek settled into evening routines, lamps being lit in windows, saloon doors swinging open to release bursts of laughter and music, miners returning from late shifts with picks over their shoulders. A community that had accepted them, embraced them, allowed them to build a life neither had dared to imagine. Within their home, the small family that had grown from the most unlikely of beginnings, a desperate woman fleeing accusations of witchcraft, a solitary cowboy haunted by war, found in each other the healing they had both sought across countless miles of prairie and years of solitude. "They called me a curse," Josephine whispered, looking down at their daughter, whose eyes were now drifting closed. "And I took that curse gladly," Henry finished. "And look what a blessing it turned out to be." Hope slept peacefully between them, the embodiment of their shared future, living proof that sometimes the darkest roads lead to the brightest destinations, and that love, when freely chosen despite all warnings, is the most powerful remedy of all.